Hi and welcome to this Cosmia Festival 2021 event brought to you in partnership with Kirklees Libraries. You can find details on the rest of the programme by visiting our website, which is cosmiafestival.co.uk, or by finding us on social media where we're Cosmia Festival basically everywhere. If you want to support the festival further, we have our Ko-Fi link which helps fund future editions like 2022 where we should have a full programme and be back in person, fingers crossed. But for now, stay safe, enjoy the show, and we'll see you very soon.
Hello, and thank you very much, Dave, for that introduction. Sorry there was a bit of reverb in there. I accidentally, took myself off on mute, but you know, you live and learn. So my name's Jude, and I'm one of the librarians for Kirklees Libraries, and I'm joined by...
I'm Rain. I think most of you all know I'm one of the library apprentices. And today we are super pleased to be hosting one of the Cosmia Festival 2020 event. If you missed any of the ones earlier this week, you can catch up on here. Honestly, go do watch them. They're absolutely amazing. Our friends at Read Bookshop in Holmfirth are also offering a 20% discount on all books featured in this year's Cosmia Festival. And there'll be more information on how to get the discount at the end of this broadcast. So please do stay tuned. And don't forget, we would love to hear from you. So please put any questions you have or any comments, anything at all in the chat box on Twitter or YouTube or on Facebook, wherever you are watching. We'll answer them as we go along.
Now let's meet our fabulous guest for today. It's Lauren James. And Lauren James is a twice Carnegie nominated British author of many young adult books. And amongst other things, today she's going to be chatting about her novel, Green Rising, which is a page-turning, super exciting new novel. So let's welcome Lauren to the screen and find out what she's going to be chatting with us about today in the Cosmia Festival event.
Hello.
Hi, Lauren.
I'm so nice to be here.
Oh, it's lovely for you to join us today. And I know, well, I'm speaking on behalf of both of us. We're really excited to hear what you're going to be talking about today, because this book, if you haven't read it already, Green Rising, do have a look at it. It's fantastic, and it keeps you gripped and it keeps you thinking on every single page. What have you got for us today, Lauren?
So Green Rising is a climate change thriller. It's about teenagers who develop magic that lets them grow plants from their fingers. And they use that to kind of solve climate change and rewild the planet. And the book was inspired by a lot of real science. So I'm going to talk you through some of the science that I use in this and all of my other novels, because I did chemistry and physics at uni. So I use my science background a lot in my books. So I'm going to do a bit of a PowerPoint presentation with some pictures as I talk you through some of the science inspirations behind my writing.
Oh, that's wonderful. So we're going to leave the screen now and say bye for now, but we're going to pop up a bit later to answer and bring on any questions that we get sent through. And I know we've got a few questions ourselves as well. So yeah, bye for now, Lauren.
Okay, let me see if I can pull up my PowerPoint. Let's give this a go. Okay, hopefully you should be able to see that. So these are some of my books. I started writing when I was 16 with The Next Together, and I got a book deal when I was 21 before I graduated uni and got published, and I've been writing ever since. So there's a whole mix of stuff up here, but the main ones I'm going to be talking about today are The Loneliest Girl in the Universe, The Quiet at the End of the World, and Green Rising, which came out in this month in September. So some of my other books include The Reckless Afterlife of Harriet Stoker, which is about a girl who explores an abandoned building and falls to her death and becomes a ghost and meets this whole society of other ghosts. I also have some short novellas out, which are good for dyslexic readers or struggling readers, starting with The Starlight Watchmaker. And then if you just want to check out my writing, I have some free books you can read, some short stories on Kindle called Another Together and Another Beginning. And then I also have I published a murder mystery novel online at gottywrites.wordpress.com, which is about a fangirl who becomes convinced there's a conspiracy theory going on with the actors of her favorite TV show. So she starts investigating and gets involved in a murder. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, you can read that all for free online. It's going to be published next year, but for now it is all online to look at. So yeah, I thought I'd dive in and tell you a bit about some of my books that have been inspired by science. The first one that I'm going to talk about is The Loneliest Girl in the Universe. This is about a girl who is alone on a spaceship. She was born to NASA astronauts, which were heading to another planet to start a colony, and they were on this journey for many decades, and along the way they had a daughter, and then when she was 12 they both died and left her completely alone. So Romy is responsible for getting this NASA spaceship to the new planet and starting a colony. One day when she's 16, she gets a message from Earth saying that a faster spaceship has launched with better technology, which is going to catch up with hers in a year. So the story takes place over a year, where she is talking to the boy on board, whose name is Jay, and getting to know him as he catches up with hers. And it's a bit of a thriller. It's a bit creepy. It uses a lot of like these empty spaceship hallways to do a bit of horror. So I'm going to talk about some of the science behind my space story there. The next one I'm going to talk about is The Quiet at the End of the World. This is about the last boy and girl born after humans stopped being able to conceive. So they're the youngest people on the planet, and they're surrounded by people who are a lot older than them. And they grow up in the ruins of London in a very small group of 300 people, knowing that they're going to be the last ones alive to watch the rest of the human race go extinct. So they spend their time exploring the remains of human civilization and trying to understand what makes life worth living when you have got no future to live for, really, and there's nothing you can do except enjoy life. And so one of the things they do is mudlarking. It's set in London, so they explore the foreshore of the River Thames, looking for any hidden treasure in the mud that's being washed away as the water erodes the soil. And this is a real thing you can do, because London has been a city for thousands of years, going back to Roman times. And for most of that time, we just threw all our rubbish in the river. So now when you walk there, you can find Roman coins and stuff on the ground. So they do a lot of that and try and just use this to understand humans. And along the way, they discover some things which lead them to work out that what they've been told about their world is not entirely true. So one of the things that I really enjoyed doing with the book was researching more about kind of archaeology and how you can what we can find in the earth can tell us about humans and what our society values. So a great example of this is this website, belowthesurface.amsterdam. So in Amsterdam, there's a lot of canals, and they've been there for hundreds of years. And they drained one of them to do some work on the pipes, and they collected every bit of rubbish they found in this one stretch of canal and put it on the website, organized by year. So it goes back from like now, when there's just like phones and credit cards and stuff, and you can scroll all the way back to the 1300s, when there's bones and silver spoons and pottery. And it's really interesting look about what we considered rubbish and what people were using at the time. So I highly recommend going and having a look at that. And obviously in the book, my characters discover things that are a bit more exciting than an old bone, but I'm not going to spoil it by telling you what. And the last book that's about science that I'm going to talk a bit about today is Green Rising, my new book. Like I said, this is about climate change. So my characters, Hester, Theo and Gabrielle, discover that they can grow plants from their hands, and they use this to do a bit of work and resist some of the corporations which are trying to benefit from climate change. Hester works for an oil company. Her dad owns the company, so she's going to inherit it one day. And Theo is the son of fishermen who are struggling to make a living as the oil company's rigs are driving away all of the fish from the area in the UK where he fishes. And so they meet, and they obviously have a lot of conflict in their views, and then they learn to work together and try to save the planet. So it's set a couple, like 10, 15 years in the future, and so things are a little bit worse with the climate, but they use these creative powers in lots of different ways to try and make a difference. So a bit about me and my writing. I've always been a massive reader. I used to go to my local library with my library card, my mum's, my dad's and my brother's, and I'd get out the maximum number of books I could and read them all and go back the next week for more. So I got to the point where I'd read everything I could find and I started writing my own stories. So here's an example from when I was 11. I wrote a little book about a statue in my local park secretly being a time machine, and I made a little cover and bound it up together. And then here's another one that I wrote when I was 16. So when I was 16, we were just told to do some writing in an English class. I didn't have very many ideas. I was a really big fan of Jane Austen and Doctor Who. I really liked how Doctor Who shows these characters that you know really well, but they go into different time periods where like the society is different. Like they could go into the past where things are really strict for women, or they could go into the far future, and it really changes how they have to interact and behave. And I really wanted to do that with some characters where you know them as people and they've got the same personalities, but they're born in different time periods, and you can see how they are grown and raised differently because of that. So here's one of the documents that I made about that. It was a romance novel, so I did the most important thing first, which was planning out what the love interest would be like. And I had made sure that he was handsome and dangerous. He had really good hair that was described a lot. And this was around the time that Twilight came out, so I was adamant that there was going to be no sparkling vampires. And I gave a little go at doing some of the plot. And this book actually got published. This turned into The Next Together, my first novel. But once I had got this idea, I really struggled with coming up with a plot because I just had a concept of these characters appearing in different time periods. So I went and sat in front of my bookshelves and I made a list of all the things that I remember really enjoying from those stories and tried to come up with a plot that would use as many of them as possible. So I didn't manage to get them all in there, but I did manage to get reincarnation, soulmates, orphans surviving and being successful, changing time, long journeys by boat, science labs. And I combined them all into a plot because my thinking was if there was something on each page that I was really excited to get to and read, then I'd be more likely to finish writing it. And it did work. It took me a while. It took me a few summer holidays and Christmas holidays while I was at uni, but I finally finished the draft when I was 20. And once I had got a book deal for my first book, you have to start thinking about what you're going to write next. And my next book, The Loneliest Girl in the Universe, was actually inspired by something I did when I was at school. So in year 12, during the summer holidays, I went to Cambridge University for a physics symposium, which sounds really boring, but I was very excited about it. Basically, for 2 weeks, I got to live in one of the colleges, go to classes, do lab experiments, and see what it would be like to be a student there. I'm in some of these pictures. You might be able to spot me. And one of the things we were looking at while we were there was Einstein's theory of special relativity, which is the idea that if you're traveling at close to the speed of light, the way that you experience time changes because time and space interact in this weird way. So we looked at this through the problem of spaceships. If you have a spaceship traveling at close to the speed of light and it travels with a twin on board for many years, and then a second twin leaves Earth in a faster spaceship, it will catch up with the first twin spaceship. But when they are reunited, they will no longer be the same age because they have experienced time differently because one of them has been traveling at really close to the speed of light. So there was a lot of maths to solve this problem in what would be the ages of them when they reunited as twins. And I wasn't as interested in that so much as I was in the idea of being the person on that first spaceship. Because regardless of whether it's your twin who's being sent to catch up with you, it would be pretty annoying to spend years alone in space only for someone to overtake you because technology's got better. You might as well have stayed at home. And so after the physics symposium, when I went back to school and I was still working on The Next Together, I was thinking about this idea of being alone in space, and that turned into the story. And when I started writing, I thought it was going to be a super easy book to write because it's just one character. Basically, they're alone in a room. They get messages from Earth and this other spaceship occasionally. But apart from that, there's not much going on. I thought it would be like a short story I'd knock out really quickly. And then I started writing it and I realized I was going to have to do a lot of research to try and get it right. So I ended up creating a 3,000 line Excel spreadsheet to work out some of the maths behind this. Because when you've got spaceships traveling in space, the way that they communicate is they send laser beams in binary code, which is picked up by a transmitter. And the binary code will be dots and dashes of light, which you can then convert into data like pictures or text or videos. And light, as I said, is the fastest thing in the universe. It travels at the speed of light, which is the fastest anything can go. So these messages go pretty fast. But if you've been traveling through space for decades, that's still going to take months to get back to Earth. So if Romy on her ship has a problem where the oxygen processor doesn't work, she would send a message to Earth asking for help, and it would take 2 months to get back to Earth. They would then reply immediately the same day with how to fix it. And it would take 2 months plus the extra time that she's been traveling in those 4 months for her to receive the reply. And so I had to know for every day of the story where the spaceships were and how long messages would take as these two spaceships were getting closer to each other but further from Earth. So it ended up being really confusing. And I did use my physics degree quite a lot to do some of this. And I sent it to my editor when I'd finished the book and was like, this is how I did it. And they were like, we're going to have to trust you. There's no way we can check this. But it's been out a few years now and nobody's like corrected me on any of the calculations. So fingers crossed I did it right. So The Quiet at the End of the World was also inspired by science in a different way. So when I graduated, I went from doing maths all the time to the point where I would kind of do an algebra problem that I was stuck on before I go to sleep. And then I would dream the algebra and wake up knowing the answer to the problem because I'd solved it. And then I graduated and stopped doing algebra completely. It was like this language that I stopped speaking, and I just found that I really missed maths and physics. And at the time I was working completely full-time as an author, so I didn't really have any time to go and do algebra. So I ended up reading a lot of non-fiction books about science. One of them was 7 Brief Lessons in Physics. So I totally wasn't reading this for any reason connected to writing. It was just for fun. But I ended up reading this quote that really struck with me. It said, "We are a short-lived genus of species. All our cousins are already extinct. We are perhaps the only species on Earth to be conscious of the inevitability of our own mortality. I fear that soon we shall also become the only species to knowingly watch the coming of its own collective demise, or at least the demise of its civilization." So basically that's saying that as humans, we are intelligent, and obviously lots of species have gone extinct before, like the one on the screen, the dodo. But we are the only one to know what that means, because we are the only one to know that we live across the whole planet and know how many of us there are. So at some point, whether that is 100 billion years from now, when we were spread out across the galaxy, or 100 years from now because of climate change, at some point we're going to go extinct and we're going to be aware it's happening. And that might be something that happens really quickly because an asteroid hits the Earth. But more likely that's going to be something that happens slowly because we stop being able to have babies, or something goes wrong and we know a long time in advance that we are going to be dying out. And that's going to be a really interesting time for humans. So I read that and I was like, wow, that would make an amazing book. Not only because it's just an interesting concept in general, but because I write about teenage characters, I think that's such an interesting position to put a teenager in when they grow up knowing that there's not really much point studying or doing anything to get a career. Like, what is the point of being alive when you're the last one left? And I think teenagers right now are already thinking that, like, are we living in a doomed world where there's no future for us? What is the point of doing anything? And how can I make a difference? And so I wanted to use this idea to look at teenagers' lives. And so I started doing some more research into extinction because I didn't know much about it beyond dinosaurs, mammoths, like the really commonly known extinct animals. And something I found out about was the Cambrian explosion, which happened 500 million years ago. And we know about it because we have these records of fossils in layers of rock in China from what used to be an ancient sea floor. So we can date the age of the rock. So we know from the fossils what kind of animals were alive 500 million years ago. And from these fossil skeletons, this is an artist's interpretation of what was going on in the sea at that time. As you can see, there's some really wild looking things here. Like this thing on the top has big boils on its top of its head, and this thing has spikes. Like, these don't look like any creatures we know today. And this happened in a very interesting time. We can see from the different layers of rock that this was an explosion of life that happened all at once. Very quickly, all of these different creatures evolved and were mutated and created. And then just as quickly, they all went extinct. And the reason they all appeared out of nowhere in this Cambrian explosion of life is that these little worms on the bottom of the seafloor developed one key feature, which meant they suddenly had to fight for survival. And what happened was one of these worms got a little bit of sensitive skin on the top of its body that meant it could detect light. And when a worm can detect light, it means it can tell if there's a shadow going overhead, which is probably going to be some kind of like hunter coming to eat it. So this worm can hide from the predator. And so the worms that survive from the predators, because they can sense shadows, are more likely to have offspring, which are also going to have this mutation that means they can sense light ahead. And then this mutation eventually grows because it kind of curves out of the body, because if it's curving outwards, it can sense light from more directions. So again, it's more likely to survive than the other worms. And you can see here, this fish in the middle has these early forms of eyes, which are bulging out of its body, and it can see in more directions. And over time, you get all of these kind of worms that can see and hide from predators. But when you have eyes, not only are you better at hiding, you're better at hunting prey, which means that there were suddenly loads and loads of really good predators around that they had to develop defensive strategies to get away from. And that's how you end up with these armor-plated things and these things with spikes. So they all quickly adapted and evolved to try and fight these new predators with eyes that were coming after them. And then just as quickly, something happened with the oxygen levels and they died out. And so we don't have them anymore. But I found this really interesting because I hadn't really thought about how closely evolution is connected to extinction. Like, you can't have new creatures appearing and evolving if you don't have things dying out. And one of these creatures eventually crawled out of the ocean and onto land, and it became our ancestors. It started living on land, and it eventually became a monkey, and then it became a human. And so by complete chance, if a different one of these had survived than the one that did, we could look completely different. Like, animal evolution could have gone in a completely different way, and we could have these spikes or armor platings. And so that was a really interesting bit of research that I brought into my novel, because I started thinking about extinction as not being like this sad thing that was happening, like humans are dying out, it's the end. It's actually not. It's kind of just the next stage in evolution, because what if we are at this point, we are in our Cambrian explosion now, and 500 million years in the future, humans are going to look back at us and think that we look as surreal and crazy as these fish do to us, because we've evolved and changed. So what is the next stage for humans if we are not the final product? Because we're obviously not. We're not perfect in any way. There's a lot of things that could be improved upon with us. And I wanted to write about what that would be like to know that you are watching the next stage of evolution for your species. So, as I said, I studied chemistry and physics at uni. This is the lab where I worked in. You can see some of the science I was doing on this poster, and this is the bit of equipment I was studying. And it was really important to me to write about characters who felt like I did when I was at uni, because before I started my degree, I was really worried that I wasn't going to be clever enough to do a science degree. Because when you see scientist characters on TV or in movies, they're kind of geniuses who know every fact and they can recall it about any topic, like about anything, regardless of what they're studying. And I definitely didn't feel that clever. I was maybe good at maths, but I couldn't memorize anything. And so I felt like really anxious when I started, until I got there and I found that everyone on my course was the same way. We used to joke that we were clever dumb, because we were really clever at one specific thing, and then we were absolute idiots at everything else. Like, we didn't know how to use a dishwasher or anything. And so I felt like a really big imposter for a really long time, because I didn't feel like I should be there, especially when I was doing experiments in the lab. Because when you do something like chemistry, you're kind of given a bit of health and safety in week 1 of uni, and then you're given access to this lab and told to just go for it. And I didn't feel like responsible enough to deal with all this stuff. And I used to get really anxious every week before my experiments. And then something happened which really made me calm down. And what happened was a professor gave me a brand new centrifuge to use. And he very proudly said it had cost the university £30,000, and I was going to be the first one to use it. And a centrifuge is basically like a big washing machine, and you put a tiny vial of liquids in, and this metal barrel spins it round, and the force of the spinning separates the contents of the vial out according to the weight of the molecules, because the heavier molecules will move to a different point in the vial to the lighter molecules. So you can then pour them off and analyze them separately. So I put my little vial in and I close the lid, and I hear this metal barrel start spinning around, and I wander off in the lab to do something else. And then I hear bang, bang, bang. And I run back, and this giant washing machine sized centrifuge is shaking from side to side. And I've seen videos of these things, and they're so powerful that if they lose control, they can smash through walls because of the force of the spinning. So I ran in and I turned it off at the wall, and it slowed down. And when I opened it, there was a massive dent in the metal barrel inside. And when something like that happens, there's not much you can do except go and tell the professor that you just broke the brand new £30,000 centrifuge. And I was really worried for weeks that I was going to have to pay for this. And eventually I plucked up my courage and asked what had been wrong. And they said it had been broken when it arrived, so it wasn't my fault. But that kind of really made me relax about being in a lab, because there's no amount of revision you can do to prepare for something like that. You just have to trust your instincts to know that you can respond to the situation when it happens. And they expect things to go wrong as well. Like, you're not going to be held responsible if they do, because in it, like, things always go wrong in every aspect of life, and you just have to deal with it when it does. And so I really wanted to write characters who were clever dumb, who made mistakes, but then who were really anxious and felt like big imposters, even though they'd done the studying and they knew their stuff, but they didn't trust themselves to do it, and they make mistakes. And so Romy on her spaceship, she's got all the NASA training, she knows what she's doing, but she still really worries about being responsible for this mission, because who wouldn't be? So in Green Rising, my book about climate change, some of the research that I started doing when I started writing it really surprised me, because when I decided to write a book about climate change, it was something I'd been thinking about for quite a while. It was such an important issue that I knew I needed to write about it, but I couldn't find a way into the story that would be optimistic. I don't write like depressing books about how terrible and doomed the future is. Even when I'm writing about the extinction of humans, I try to make it positive and uplifting and show the nice side of humanity and how good the future is. And I found that was really hard to talk about with climate change, because it doesn't seem like it's going to have any positive effect. And eventually I came up with this idea of teenagers actively taking control and doing something to help, inspired by movements like Extinction Rebellion, where teenagers are going on school strikes and getting in the news. And that seemed like a really positive way to show it, because I'm not trying to fix everything that's going wrong. I'm just kind of showing how collectively, if we work together, we can make a difference and get people to pay attention to us. So I started researching more about climate change, and I thought I knew a lot already because I've studied it at university, but we'd mainly focused on the science. I never really thought about the political and economic side of climate change. And it turns out that's like the main problem with why we haven't fixed it. A lot of oil companies that create fossil fuels are really against us doing anything about climate change, because that is going to mean that we will stop buying their oil and their petrol. So since the 80s, they've been actively like running campaigns to say that global warming isn't real. This is an example of one of their internal documents where they've said that they need to try and make sure that people, the general public, feel uncertain about what climate change is. And this is an example of one of an ad that they ran trying to stop people from caring about climate change and doing anything about it. And this is like such a big thing that I knew that I would have to make it part of my story, because if you just focus on the science, the story doesn't make any sense, right? Because like, we have solutions. Why have we not done anything about it? And the reason we haven't done anything about it is because lots of people have an interest in making sure that we don't. They're making a lot of money off the climate. And even when we have climate crisis and terrible things happening, they're still making money off fixing those problems. So they don't really want to stop it. And so I knew I would have to write a story that took into account the billionaires and the fossil fuel company organizations that are working on the other side. They believe climate change is real. They don't just deny that it exists and ignore it. But even though they think it's real, they're still trying to stop it being fixed. So another thing that I found out when I was researching that I really wanted to include was Juliana versus the United States. This is a lawsuit that was filed a couple of years ago by some teenagers who sued the actual United States, the government, because they said that the government had violated their constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property by not actually doing anything to stop climate change. And this is still an ongoing lawsuit, but it's an example of like how much we can hold the people who are politicians but also own oil companies responsible for this issue because they've not done anything about it. And it all ties in to politics and economics in this very confusing way that I didn't know anything about as someone who's mainly just studied science. So I ended up having to do a lot of research into this. And all of my books, I end up finding I've suddenly got to do lots of research that I didn't expect to do. When I was writing The Quiet at the End of the World, I was thinking about what I would do with my life if I was one of the last humans on Earth. And, you know, there's no point going and getting a job because you just have a little farm that feeds you and that's all you need to do. And I started thinking that if that was me, I would probably want to leave a message for the future that kind of said, this is what I like, humans lived here, this is what we were like, this is what we cared about, and just like write a letter to anyone who might find it, whether that is an alien who comes to the Earth and finds the ruins of our cities, or a species on Earth which evolves to become intelligent enough to do archaeology. So like a dolphin is very clever, or an octopus or a crow is really clever. Like they have the kind of brains where in a million years they could possibly be intelligent enough to look at the ruins of our society and see that that was built by something. And actually, it turns out that when you try and find a way to communicate into the far future, it's really difficult. So we have examples of communication from 17,000 years ago from the art done inside caves. And this was done by humans across the whole planet, not just inside caves. Caves are the only ones that have survived, but these like drawings were everywhere. And we don't really know what they mean. We know that obviously this is a drawing of animals, but we don't know what it meant to the people who drew it. Is this a record of what was in the area at a certain time of year? Is this a guide to hunting that they used to train their youngsters? Is this a story? Is this the god that they worshipped? We don't really know how to interpret it. It's only recently that we've worked out that certain drawings have multiple lines on that look really messy, because if you hold a torch up to it and move it, it kind of animates and looks like the horse's legs are moving. We used to assume that they just weren't very good at drawing horses. So even when we've got these pictures, we can't really interpret them in a way that makes sense. Another example is only 5,000 years ago, which is from South America. The Incas used to have this really complicated form of writing that used strings of different colours and lengths with knots placed in them. And this was a really complicated language that the one on the screen could have been represented a whole novel or a whole text. And when South America was colonized, most of these examples were destroyed. So we don't have enough of them to decode them and work out what this one says, which is a real shame, because if you think about amazing works of literature from the past, like Beowulf and the Odyssey, they're really fascinating looks into a point of view, and we have these, but we don't have any way to interpret them. So if you think about trying to leave a message for an octopus 100,000 years in the future, it's almost impossible to find a way to write a letter to them that they would be able to interpret, especially when you think about how much biology plays into our forms of writing. So as humans, we are symmetrical down the middle. We have 2 arms and 2 legs, and our brain has 2 halves, and it all reflects in the middle, which means that our writing is also 2-dimensional. It goes across the page and down the page. An octopus has 8 legs and its brain has 8 parts, and everything it does is circular. So if it got to the point where it could create language, it would be some kind of circular form that represented those 8 parts of its brain. So it would probably look at some writing by us and not even understand it as communication, because it's so different from how it thinks. And so we'd have to try and find a way to communicate that got past that. Now, this is something that we have thought about before. When the Hoover Dam was built in America in the 30s, this was recognized to be one of the biggest human-made things that is visible from space, because you can see this river suddenly stops. And so the idea was in the 30s, if any alien comes to Earth in a spaceship, it's going to see that there is something created this dam, and it would probably land nearby, because that would be where the intelligent life was. And so when they built the dam, they constructed a mosaic on the floor to try and communicate with anything that found it. And they found this really difficult. So what they ended up doing was they drew these yellow dots, which showed where the stars were in the sky on the day the dam was built. And you can see this kind of timeline that shows the movement of the stars going back all the way to the Egyptian times and onto the future. And the stars like rotating meant that they would only look in like this specific constellation at the point the dam was built, which is basically the only thing we can communicate for certain with another species, because every species is going to look up at the space and see the same stars. They might not see them as the same color. They might not see them with eyes. They might only be able to sense heat. They might only see infrared, but those stars are going to be in the same orientation. And so we can communicate, this is how far back this was made. Anything else beyond that is really impossible to communicate with another species. And this is a really important idea that I ended up using in my book, because there are things that we need to communicate with other humans into the future. So if you think about radioactive waste, it's going to be radioactive for 10,000 years, which means that we need to have a way to tell humans, don't go near these barrels of waste or swim in the water that they're stored in, because it will hurt you. We also have these places called Doomsday seed vaults. This is one in Norway in the side of a mountain, which is filled with cold storage seeds, which are going to last for thousands of years. We know that they're going to last that long because we've managed to grow a date palm from a 32,000-year-old seed from the Egyptian pyramids. So these Norway tunnels, we need to find a way to communicate. If there's an apocalypse or something, go in here, you will find ways to restart civilization. Although this particular example has since flooded because of rising sea levels from climate change. So it's possible it might not be around for that long, but the idea remains. And so it's something that I think about a lot, is how can we communicate these ideas and talk about science in a way that is easy to understand? And tying this back into climate change, it's obviously something I thought about a lot when I was writing, particularly when I was thinking about how to talk about all of these solutions for climate change which exist and have not yet been done. So you can see here a whole list of ways that we know how to fix climate change that just needs the funding and support to happen. And you can, this article from The Onion is satire from 2014 saying, scientists politely remind the world that clean energy technology is ready to go whenever. And really nothing has changed since 2014, but we haven't really done much about it. And so part of the thing I wanted to do with the story was show some of these techniques actually be used and demonstrate like what that would be like in practice and who would lose out and who would win from those things. Most of the time, it's going to provide more jobs. It's going to provide more income to people who are being employed to do these things. So it's going to be a positive thing for society, even if you don't really believe climate change is an issue. So it's really important that we start doing a lot of these things anyway. And something else that I really wanted to write about in the book was geoengineering. So if you've not heard this word, it's something you're going to be hearing a lot about over the next few decades. Geoengineering is the idea that we don't just stop using fossil fuels, but we start changing the planet to adjust to the fossil fuels. So obviously the big problem is that we're releasing chemicals into the air which retain the heat from the sun. So the idea is that if we put a big mirror in space, it will reflect that some heat away from the Earth to counteract that rising temperature. You can also pump CO2 and carbon dioxide under the sea. You can put aerosol chemicals in space, which absorb some of the heat. Like all of these crazy ideas, which sound very futuristic and sci-fi-ish and pretty impressive. And actually, they're not that great. Like, we don't really want to fill the air with chemicals where we have no idea what they're going to do, and we don't want to waste loads of billions of dollars on constructing a giant mirror in space instead of just changing how cars and trucks work. Like, a lot of these things seem like they're amazing solutions, but actually they're just ways of avoiding the issue that fossil fuel companies want to support, so they can keep doing what they're doing as they do it now. So I started putting some of that in the book as well, where you've got some characters who think these ideas are amazing and some characters who know that they're not, and all of these complicated issues that are tied into a very emotional topic. So to summarize before we go to questions, I just wanted to talk a bit about how I go about using some science. Once I've got an idea for a story, what's the next step in turning that into a whole novel? So usually I would find that my interest has been captured by a particular concept of something like extinction or climate change or space, and I'll go away and read as many articles about it as I can. And what I usually try to look for is theories which have been disproven. So something that I find really interesting is when we find dinosaur fossils, we assume they look a certain way, like reptiles. So if you've seen the original Jurassic Park film, T-Rex is like a big reptile scaly thing. And actually that's completely wrong. They actually had feathers. So T-Rex would have looked more like a giant blue tit, but it wouldn't have made a scarier film. And I find those ideas really interesting because they show such like creative leaps between the fact that we know is true because we have evidence of it and what we want to be true. And I think that these geoengineering concepts that I mentioned are a similar idea of like this theory which people are pitching, which in a few decades is going to turn out to be completely wrong. But it shows this creative link from like, we have a problem with the climate. What if we put a mirror in space? There's a big leap in thinking there that is a really interesting from a point of view of looking at how humans panic and think about ideas. So I follow the thing that interests me. I look for any questions I have or things that I don't understand. And I don't necessarily try and put all of the explanations in the story. They just feed into how I create characters, because my characters are also not going to understand stuff. And they're also going to find things interesting and follow certain pathways and come up with ideas that don't work. And that's how you make it feel realistic. And I'm not trying to write stories that explain science. Like, if you read one of my books, you're not going to know everything about evolution or how to run a spaceship or how to fix the climate. I'm just trying to write a good story that is exciting to read and makes you have fun and feel good about the planet and humanity. And the science is just like a way to come into the story and set you off on this path and have a good adventure time. So that's the end of my presentation. I know I talked about a lot of different science stuff there, but hopefully you found that interesting. I'd love to answer some questions if you have any about any of that, or just any of my other books in general, because obviously, as I said, I've written books about ghosts, I've written novellas and time travel books, so I'm happy to talk about anything.
Hi, Lauren. Wow. I'm still processing. That was fantastic, hearing so much in such a short space of time about what inspires, what the science is. It was wonderful, and it got me thinking about how I'm going to start communicating with octopus, or octopi, I think it is.
Yeah.
I thought that was I didn't know that about the brain of an octopus. And I just thought, what an amazing journey you go on as an author, from being a scientist and an author together. Such a great, what that does. I thought it was just absolutely fascinating and informative and inspiring. And I'm just looking at Ambreen to see whether Ambreen has any comments before we move into questions.
Well, I was going to say at the beginning of this session, I dislike science. Now I'm like totally different side.
Sold on it now.
Excellent. Yeah, that's exactly what I want to hear. Because I think like people think of science as this really boring thing, but actually it's just like a way of us humans looking at the universe and trying to understand it in like the most exciting, interesting ways possible. And when you look at like the actual results of science and ignore like the maths and the theories and the experiments that get there, the results are amazing. Like they're telling us these fascinating things, and that's the bit that interests me. And I get to jump around and look at all of those results without having to spend any time in a lab doing the experiments, which is kind of ideal.
Wow. And then share them through your books, which kind of drops little bits of information in, which makes you start to want to look and read and maybe find out more about certain things.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, through that amazing creativity. I'm going to jump a little bit back to Green Rising, because I know you were talking about Green Rising and the special things that happen to the young people who grow plants from their fingers. And I just wondered how you might feel if you suddenly found that you had a new ability and became part of Green Fingers. Oh, sorry. Is that me buzzing?
I would love to be a Green Fingers, not only just because I'm like a really passionate gardener. I think that would be so fun to be able to go into my garden and fill it with peonies and clematis and passion flowers, and just at any time of year have amazing flowers in my garden. But also because like I do think there's so many, like something that came about as I was researching how we would use plants to like rehabilitate the planet. I've become really aware now of like any areas I go where there's just big stretches of barren lawn or empty lots that are just concrete, and it's such a shame, not just because that could be a beautiful meadow with full of wildflower, but because you've just taken away any diversity of life. Like there's no insects there's absolutely nothing like growing, and obviously you need to have insects because that's what feeds birds, and then that leads into all these other parts of the environment that we're slowly taking away their places to live. And obviously we need human infrastructure, but there's so many places where we could be giving them these environments back that fit into a human society and civilization that we're not, because there's nobody out there thinking about it in those terms. So yeah, I would love Green Fingers, and I would be using it to be a big rebel and going into different areas of the city and creating wildflower meadows.
I was trying to say, I'm so sorry. I had a really weird technical difficulty then. So I'm going to watch back and get your answer from the recording that we'll have made. So I'm sure it was fantastic, and Ambreen will be able to fill me in on that as well. So thank you. And I do apologize for jumping out.
I'm just wondering how it would, say theoretically you could grow plants. Would that mean the plants would have your DNA and evolve to be intelligent? Or say you're obviously cutting them off yourself to plant them or whatever, would it hurt? Because obviously they're growing from you, aren't they?
I love that. So in the book, you can cut them off and it doesn't hurt. But as the story goes on, my characters are doing more and more plant stuff. They're like really growing intensive plants at all hours of the day. And it does start to have an effect in that they turn into like these plant hybrid creatures themselves. And there's kind of like bones that break because they're taking all of the nutrients out of them. So yeah, it wouldn't necessarily be a positive thing all around, which I guess is fair anyway. You don't want to have any magic where it feels like a cheat, where you get all the benefits and you don't have to put in any work, because that's not fair. So yeah, maybe I wouldn't use it all the time, just as a rare special treat.
I was so we've got a number of different characters, and when they all go to a special training camp, I don't think that's giving too much away, is it? Because they're coming together. I won't say too much more about that. But I just wondered how the different characters felt about coming together, really, because I think within your book it shows that the different characters, which I know you've alluded to earlier, about Hester being the daughter of a kind of oil baron, really. So this, top of this oil company. And then you've got another character called Theo, who is part of a fishing family. And you've got very different characters coming together and feeling quite differently about the position that they found themselves in. So I just wondered how they might have felt in that position, particularly in the main characters.
Yeah, they do find it really difficult at first, especially because they're being presented with like the oil company's view on climate change and what these plants are going to be used for, which Hester is kind of, it's her first opportunity to show how good she is at running the business, and she takes on this project by herself where she's going to use these green fingers to create biofuels, so growing plants and then using them as a new form of fuel where you burn them and make char. And she starts working with another company where they partner up with a space company, which is starting to create a colony on Mars. And the plan is that these green fingers are going to be used to help generate this energy on this new colony. And so she's got these very set ideas in mind that she's really proud of and excited about, because she's 18. Like, she's really excited to show all these like innovative things that she can do with the company and show her youth and passion. And then Theo comes in and he's furious. He's like, this is not what you should be doing with any of these plants. You should be using them to save Earth, not go to Mars. And you are completely blind to all of the ways that what your company does affects the world, and like how it's affected our fishing industry. And like they really kind of like clash immediately, and they're both think they're in the right and they can't see each other's point of view. And it takes a while for them to start working together and understand that this is a nuanced thing, and that what they've both heard about climate change from being in the UK education system versus the American education system, and being raised in a company that have certain beliefs or that are affected in certain ways, all of that changes how they feel about this topic, because it is an emotional topic and it's very subjective, and like there's so many things that tie into how they feel about climate change that they have to address, and neither of them are in the right, and they have to both learn to change some of their views and be a bit more flexible, which is very exciting.
And what a wonderful sort of thing to kind of travel with them on that journey as well, because we can all be a bit like that, can't we, where we think, oh, I know about that, I'm right, and you do have to spend some time listening to the other point of view, don't you, and seeing if there's some middle ground. And it's wonderful.
One of the things that's really exciting is when Gabrielle comes into it, because she is kind of a protester who works with like school strikes, and she's very, very anti-capitalist and very anti-law. And she comes in with a third point of view where she's like, I don't believe that we can do anything wrong. Anything we do in the name of climate activism is allowed. And the other characters are like, okay, so you're actively breaking the law. And it kind of throws this third point of view in, which explodes it all a bit. So it's really fun, and it was really interesting to write. And I had to do a lot of research, but
wonderful. And I know Amber mentioned a bit earlier about the characters and how it sort of shows how climate change affects everybody. I think you were mentioning that, weren't you, Amber? Which I thought was
I was saying I really like the idea of how you brought these three characters in from three very, very different backgrounds, and it just showcases that climate change isn't just one group issue. Everyone's affected by it, and everyone needs to collaborate with each other in order to have an effective solution.
Yeah, it was really important to me to have characters come from all over the world. Like all of the trainees come from different areas of the planet, because I think we hear so much about climate activists from like America and the UK and Europe, but those are not the places which are going to be affected as much by climate change. And there are so many amazing activists working in places like Bangladesh and Brazil that are doing a huge amount of work, because they're going to be hugely affected, but we don't hear about them as much in the news in our country. And I wanted to make sure to show that like a lot of the important work is being done by people we are never going to have the name recognition of like Greta Thunberg, but they are out there and they're doing really important stuff as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that. I was going to ask if there was whether you were surprised by anything a particular character did. So obviously you're the one who created the characters and you're following them on their journey through your writing, but did you ever get to a point where a character kind of surprised yourself when you were writing and you just went, whoa, I didn't expect them to kind of go down that route?
I think Hester's dad really surprised me because he obviously is this oil baron. And I started out the book thinking he was just going to be the villain. He was going to be a horrible person who has been like I took the research from ExxonMobil where they were actively running these ad campaigns about climate change denial. And I was like, he's going to be the one doing that. He's going to be terrible and really cruel and careless. And then I started writing him and it didn't make sense because humans aren't like that really. We're very nuanced people. We always see ourselves as the good guys and we don't necessarily see the harm we're doing. And there are in real life like about 90 people in the world who are actively causing climate change, but they're not sociopaths or anything. They're like normal people who have families that they love. They would be really upset if their pet died. Like they're really proud of the support they're doing to give their grow a community and provide for their employees, and that is what they're going to be focused on, not the damage they're doing to the planet. They would be horrified if they were called villains. And so as I wrote his point of view, I had to really kind of develop that character and make him into a realistic person because yes, he's doing really terrible things, but he's still a dad that loves his daughter and wants her to take over the company, and like he's been caring for her whole life, and you can't have those two things match up if you don't show the nuance there. So I want to hear your answer though. What really surprised you about the characters? Is there anything they're doing that has caught you by
I think I'm just like I think I'm kind of surprised by all. I think I'm just surprised generally with the books because it's such a unique idea, the thought of growing things from your own body, these plants and things. And part of me was both horrified by it but absolutely loving it because like, you know, the green algae that comes from Theo to start with, and yet you've got a little daisy growing out of Hester's shoulder and stuff. I think what I loved about it is that they are very human characters, and like you say, they're not one-dimensional, so you feel like you get to know them and all the nuances in them. And Hester's journey I kind of love because she's so, everything is corporate, a pencil skirt, the way she dresses and everything. But obviously she doesn't stick on that narrow path, which is what we do, isn't it? We start off on one kind of path and then we're open to others. And it means that we can develop and grow and be challenged, which I think is what they all get, you know, they all have happened to them, which is wonderful. Any other questions, Ambreen, from your point of view? I'm just conscious that we've got 3 minutes to go. So
I've got one last question, and it's, you mentioned in your presentation, obviously your books are full of hope and they're not, you know, all gloom and doom. But as a scientist and looking at the current situation of how it's obviously climate change is not being taken seriously enough, why is it that you're choosing to focus on your books being hopeful rather than maybe showing how, you know, dreadful it is, or how it's not, how it is doom and gloom?
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I actually run a group called the Climate Fiction Writers League, where I support writers who are publishing books about climate change. There's over 100 of us, and we have like a regular newsletter with essays about climate fiction. And one of the big things I found with working with the group and founding it is how many books there are that show kind of a dystopian post-apocalyptic look on climate change, and they're not actually telling you about anything about climate change. They're kind of just showing you the dangers. And I think we're past the point in the conversation where we need to be warned about the dangers. Like, we all are aware of how terrible it's going to be, and yet people don't know about things like geoengineering. Like, had either of you heard of those geoengineering space mirrors or anything? Yeah, and those are that's the conversation we need to be having. Should we be installing space mirrors or spraying chemicals into the atmosphere? And we need to move into that part of like the solutions focused part of the conversation, because that's the bit that's going to be relevant to our lives over the next decade.
And
so,
to the people growing, I was talking to Ambreen before that I can't help but have that idea that there's somebody growing up now who's got creativity, more than one person, creativity, imagination, and things can, technology, there's all the different things that are going on in the world that part of me can't help but think somebody or a group of people, whether they're green fingers or somebody else, will have that spark of an idea that takes us forward in a way that we never imagined.
It is really difficult because when you think about it, when you like look at the data, like it's too late now for any children to be doing something. It needs to be happening before they grow up. We've got 10 years,
absolutely.
15
We
years.
all need to be doing things now.
Yeah, but at the same time, you don't want to be telling those kids like the future is doomed, there's no point trying, because that's not fair on them to grow up terrified. So what my writing is kind of a mix of being to show children that it's not their responsibility and that there is a future to aim for, and that they can look forward to it, and not, they shouldn't be terrified every day. And also to their parents who might work in London in a finance company that is still investing money in fossil fuels, or, you know, all these people who like work for companies where they haven't yet made changes. Like, those are the people I want to read my books and actually take action, and they're the ones that can make a change. If you work for a city council, like you're the one who can like help make and help fund the council doing things in the area that it might not have done before. And so it's a combination of both of those things of what I'm trying to say.
Fantastic. Wow. So I feel that's amazing. Any last words, Ambreen? We just need to have a little chat about the Read bookshop offer as well, but I'm just making sure Ambreen hasn't got any questions, or you haven't got any questions to ask Lauren either before we end the broadcast.
No, but that was an absolutely amazing session.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely.
It was absolutely fantastic. We've just got, if you don't mind just hanging around for a moment or two, Lauren, we've just got a couple of things to round off. So we have, let's just have a look about the discount that you can get. So Read Bookshop, our partners who are, I'm just going to get the banner up, it won't be a moment. Read Bookshop, which is our partners, a lovely bookshop in Home Firth. They're offering a 20% discount on all the books featured in the Cosmia Festival. I shall just get some details about how you can access that. You can both access it online by going to, here we are, going to be read.co.uk, or follow them on Twitter at read_homefirth. Or if you want to go in person to pick up a book or to buy one of the books, you can go to Read Home Firth, 41 Huddersfield Road, Home Firth, HD9 3JH. So that's the Read bit. We're not at the end of the, let me just get rid of that banner. We're not at the end of the Cosmia Festival just yet. We've still got a few more events, but I just want to say an enormous thank you to Lauren James. And if you haven't read the book yet, do have a look. Either borrow it from the library or pop along to the Read Bookshop and get your discount and buy your own copy. We're just going to put up a little bit of detail about what's coming for the next Cosmia event, but we'll just say bye and get the details up for you to have a look at and have a little read. And we'll just say thanks again, Lauren. Let me just get up about it. It's Emily Barr who's going to be next. And hopefully we'll see you again. Bye.
Bye.